By the second week of November, the year Nora Brandvold turned 56, the tin box on the kitchen shelf held $76.40. She had counted it 3 times that morning, not because the number would change, but because her hands needed something to do while the rest of her refused to believe it. She had been a widow for 11 years, and in all that time, this was the lowest the box had ever been. The wind came down off the big snowy mountains the way it always did in November, dragging the open shoulder of land the maps called Cold Water Bench, rattling the loose pane in the kitchen window that Hal had always meant to fix and never had. Nora stood at the counter in her dead husband's wool coat. The sleeves rolled twice and listened to the house settle around her. Out past the glass, the grass had gone the color of old bone, and the sagebrush bent all one direction, and the light had that thin, scoured quality that the high plains take on just before the first real snow. She poured coffee she had already reheated twice. She did not sit down. There were 33 ewes left in the lower pen. That morning she had walked the fence line, counting them, her breath smoking, the half-frozen ground crunching under her boots, and the number had come out the same as the day before, which was something. They were old ewes, most of them past their best lambing years, the kind a buyer wanted only by the pound. The feed store in Wren had carried her account into a 4th month, and the man behind the counter, Del Hovland, had stopped meeting her eyes when she came in, which was his way of being kind. A notice had come from the bank in Lewistown, folded twice in a window envelope, and she had set it on the table unopened, the way you set down something you already know the weight of. 11 years a widow, 56 years old, $76.40. Those were the numbers, and Nora was a woman who had learned not to argue with numbers. She had not always been poor. She and Halvor had never been rich, not by any measure a banker would respect, but for 20 years the place had carried them. A few hundred head in the good years, a wool check in June that smelled of lanolin and possibility, a garden, a deep freeze full of lamb and venison, a woodpile that reached the eaves by October. Hal had been a big, slow-moving man with hands like the roots of a tree, a sheepman whose own father had come over from a hard valley in Norway with nothing but a knife, and the knowledge of how to keep animals alive in weather that wanted them dead. Hal carried that knowledge the way other men carried a wallet. He could deliver a breech lamb in the dark by feel alone, his arm to the shoulder in a straining ewe, his voice never rising above the murmur he used for frightened things. He had married Nora when she was 24, and he had been gone 11 years now, taken by a quiet thing in his chest in the space of a single winter, and the grief of it had never once felt like 11 years. It felt like a room she had walked out of that morning and could still hear, if she stood still. After he died, the place had begun the slow unspooling that places do when the hands that knew them go into the ground. The good rams aged out, and she could not afford to replace them. A wet spring took more lambs than she could save alone. The barn roof lost shingles she had no money to buy. One bad year leaned against the next, and the next leaned against that, until 11 of them stood stacked like fence posts behind her, and she found herself at 56 counting coins in a tin, and waiting for the snow that would decide whether the last 33 ewes were worth the hay it took to keep them. She told herself she was not frightened. She was a practical woman, and practical women do not indulge fear the way the comfortable do. But that morning, standing in the cold kitchen in her husband's coat, she had felt something underneath the practicality that she did not have a polite word for. It was the feeling of being the last one awake in a house where the lights are going out one by one. It was the feeling that the road that had brought her here had quietly run out of road. The dog lay by the cold stove, watching her with his one good eye. Juno was old now, older than a working dog had any business being, a black and white border collie gone gray at the muzzle, his left eye a flat blue blind from a kick years ago that he had taken closing a gate that Hal had left open. He had been Hal's dog before he had been anyone's, and after the funeral he had spent a full week lying in the dirt at the head of the lane, facing the road, until Nora had carried him inside herself. He still went out to the cold pen every morning and lay where he could see the ewes, doing the only work he had ever known, holding the line by the simple fact of his presence. He was no use anymore. She would no sooner have parted with him than with her own hand. She set the coffee down half drunk. There was wood to split, and water to break in the trough, and the whole long arithmetic of a day to get through. And none of it would do itself for her grieving over it. It was the dog who heard the gate. Juno's head came up off his paws, the gray ears lifting, and he made the low sound in his chest that was not quite a growl, the sound he kept for things that did not belong. Nora had heard nothing. The wind ate most sounds out here before they reached the house. But she had lived long enough alongside that dog to trust his ears over her own. She set down the stove lid she had been lifting and went to the window. A figure stood at the far gate where the lane met the county road. For a moment Nora took it for a fence post. The frost had thrown a shadow on. The figure was so still. Then it moved. A small, hunched movement. The movement of someone gathering courage rather than crossing distance. And she saw that it was a person, and that the person was young, and that the person was alone. No vehicle on the road behind, no dust. Whoever it was had come on foot, which on Coldwater Bench meant they had come a very long way, because there was nothing in walking distance but more of the same emptiness in every direction. Nora stood at the glass and watched the way her own husband had taught her to watch, without hurry, taking the measure of a thing before she moved toward it. The figure came a few steps up the lane and stopped. Came a few more and stopped again. It was a woman Nora could see now, a girl really, though Nora had reached the age where everyone under 30 looked like a girl to her. Thin inside a denim jacket that was wrong for the season, the collar turned up, the hands jammed deep in the pockets. A canvas bag hung off one shoulder, the strap pulling the jacket sideways. Dark hair whipping loose across a face that was turned, even now half toward the road behind her, as though she were keeping watch on the way she had come. That was the thing Nora noticed, before she noticed anything else. Not the thinness, not the wrong jacket, not the long walk written in the way the girl held her shoulders. The way she kept glancing back. People who keep looking behind them are running from something. Nora knew it the way she knew weather. She had not always known it, but 11 years of living alone at the end of a road teaches a woman to read the few who come up it. The mailman drove straight in, unhurried, a man with no reason to fear the open. The occasional hunter came with a wave and a question, his truck nosed politely at the gate. The men from the bank came slow and reluctant, the way men come who would rather be somewhere else. But the ones who came on foot, watching the road behind them, those were a different kind, and there had not been many of them in 11 years. But Nora remembered everyone. They came rarely now. There had been a time before Hal died when they came more often. She had never fully understood why, back then, and she had been too busy with the living to ask. She watched the girl take another few steps and stop again, and she saw the moment the girl saw the dog through the window, and the way the girl went absolutely still at the sight of him, the way a wild thing freezes. And something in Nora that had been counting coins and tallying U's and waiting for snow set all of that down for a moment and went to the door. The cold came in around her when she opened it, the real cold, the kind that found the gaps in a coat. Juno pushed past her legs and out onto the step, but he did not bark and he did not go down the lane. He stood at the top of the steps with his hackles smooth and his head level, and he looked at the girl the way he looked at a sheep that had wandered but not yet bolted. A long, steady, unhurried look, and then he sat down. He simply sat, as though he had decided something. Nora had seen that dog read 100 strangers, and she had never once known him to be wrong. The girl stood at the bottom of the lane, perhaps 40 feet off, and did not come closer. Up close, or close enough, she looked worse than she had at the gate. Her face was wind-burned and gray with tiredness, the kind of tiredness that goes past the body and into the eyes. There was a yellowing bruise along one cheekbone, old enough to be fading, fresh enough to still be there. She could not have been more than 20. She held the strap of her canvas bag with both hands now, gripping it the way a person grips the rail of a boat in rough water, and when she spoke her voice came thin and dry, half torn away by the wind, so that Nora had to lean into the cold to catch it. The girl asked if there was any work, anything at all. She said she could clean or split wood or feed stock or mend. She said she did not want money. She said she would do whatever needed doing for something to eat, and a place out of the wind until morning, and then she would be gone, and the woman would never have to see her again. It was that last part that told Nora the most. She would be gone, and the woman would never have to see her again. As though the girl had already learned, somewhere, that the worst thing she could be to anyone was a thing that stayed. The wind came across the bench and pushed at both of them. Somewhere down in the lower pen, a ewe called, and another answered. The blind dog sat on the top step, with his good eye on the girl, calm as still water. Nora was a woman who had $76.40 to her name, a bank notice she had not opened, 33 old ewes, and a winter coming on that she was not at all sure she would get through. She had every reason in the world to say she had no work, which was true, and no food to spare, which was nearly true, and to close the door against the cold and the stranger both, and go back to the arithmetic of her own survival. She thought of none of that. Or rather, she thought of all of it, in the space of a breath, and set it aside, because there was an older arithmetic in her than the one in the tin box, and it had been put there by a big, slow-moving man with hands like roots, and it had never once balanced, and had never once steered her wrong. "You come up out of that wind," Nora said. "Nobody talks business on an empty stomach." Not here. The girl did not move. She looked at the open door, and the warm dark of the house behind it, and then she looked back down the empty county road one more time, that quick, frightened glance, and Nora understood that the girl was not weighing whether to trust her. The girl was weighing whether trusting anyone was a thing she could still afford. "Come on," Nora said again, softer. "The dog likes you. He's particular. Come on." And maybe it was the dog, or maybe it was the word particular, said the way you'd say it about a person and not an animal, as though the girl's worth was a thing already being measured and found sufficient. Whatever it was, the girl came. She came up the lane slow and wary, her eyes going to the windows and the corners of the buildings the way a person's eyes go, who has learned that danger comes from the edges of things, and she stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at Nora and at the dog, and Juno leaned forward and put his gray nose against the back of her hand, once, gently, and then sat back down as though his work were done. The girl made a small sound. It might have been the start of a word, or it might have been the sound a person makes when something kind happens to them, and they have gone too long without it to know how to hold still under it. Then she came up the steps, and Nora stood back to let her pass into the warmth, and closed the door against the wind. Inside, the house was small and low-ceilinged, and smelled of wood smoke and old wool, and the coffee Nora had reheated too many times. There was a long pine table worn pale at the edges, mismatched chairs, a cast-iron stove with its belly going gray, a window over the dry sink that looked out at the cold pen and the gray hills beyond. On the wall by the door hung a row of pegs, coats, a halter, a coil of soft cotton rope, and Hal's old felt hat, which Nora had never once been able to take down. The girl stood just inside the door, with her bag still on her shoulder, taking it all in, her body still half-turned toward the way out, the habit of flight worn so deep into her that she could not put it down even in the warmth. Nora did not crowd her. She went to the stove and opened the firebox and fed it 2 splits of pine. And the flames came up and threw their light into the room, and she put the kettle over and pulled the cold pot of beans from that morning to the front of the heat. She moved the way Hal had taught her to move around frightened things, without quickness, narrating nothing, asking nothing. She set out a bowl. She cut bread from the half-loaf in the box, the last of it, and did not let herself think about the last of it. She poured milk that she had been saving. "You can set that bag down," she said, not turning around. "Nobody's going to take it." The girl set the bag down. She did it slowly, and she set it against the leg of her chair where she could reach it, but she set it down. When the beans were hot, Nora brought the bowl to the table and set it in front of the girl with the bread beside it, and she said, simply, "Eat." And then she went and sat in her own chair at the head of the table, the one that had been Hal's, with her own cold coffee in her hands, so that the girl would not have to eat under anyone's eyes. She looked out the window at the cold pen. She gave the girl the gift of not being watched. For a moment nothing happened. Then Nora heard the spoon. The girl ate the way the truly hungry eat, the way Nora had seen exactly twice before in her life and never forgotten. Fast at first, then forcing herself slow, then fast again when the slowness lost, her free hand curved around the bowl as though to guard it, shoulders folded forward over the food. She ate as though the bowl might be taken. She ate as though she had learned. Somewhere, that food was a thing that came and mostly went, and that the only sure portion was the one already inside you. She finished the beans, and Nora got up without a word and filled the bowl again, and the girl looked up at her then, with something raw and unguarded in her tired face, something that was almost worse to look at than the bruise, and Nora only nodded at the bowl and said, "There's plenty," which was not true, and sat back down. The second bowl the girl ate slower. The bread she folded and tucked into her sleeve before she seemed to know she was doing it, then caught herself and went red, and started to take it back out, and Nora said, without turning from the window, "That's yours, you keep it, that's what it's for." And the girl left it in her sleeve, and something in the set of her shoulders came down a half-inch, the first thing about her that had eased since she came through the door. When the bowl was empty, The girl wrapped both hands around the cup of milk and held it without drinking, just for the warmth of it, and stared at the table. The fire ticked in the stove. Juno had come to lie under the table at the girl's feet, his chin on her boot, and she did not seem to know whether to move or be still, and so was still. Nora let the quiet sit a while, then she asked the only question worth asking first. "What do I call you?" The girl was a long time answering. Nora watched her work at it, watched the small war in her face, and understood that the girl was deciding not what her name was, but whether to give the real one, and that the deciding was costing her something, because it's the first thing you give a person, and the last thing you can take back. At last the girl said, "Selah." She said it low, and watching Nora's face as she said it, the way you watch to see if a lie will land. Nora had raised no children and buried a husband and lived 11 years at the end of a road, reading the few who came up it, and she knew a half-given name when she heard one. She did not press it. A name half-given was still more than the girl had walked in with. "Selah," Nora said, as though it were a fine and ordinary name and the matter was settled. "I'm Nora. This is Juno. He was my husband's dog. He doesn't take to strangers, so you can think well of yourself there." Selah almost smiled. It did not quite arrive, but Nora saw where it would have been. "You're not from anywhere near here," Nora said. It was not a question, so the girl did not have to answer it, and that was the point of saying it that way. "Long walk in off that road. There's nothing back the way you came for 40 miles but Wren, and Wren's not much." "I came in on a ride," Selah said, "part way. Then I walked." Nora nodded as though that explained everything, which it did not, and let it lie. From whom the girl had taken a ride, and to whom she had not wished to stay, and what had put the fading bruise on her cheek and the watching in her eyes. Those were not questions for a first bowl of beans. Hal had taught her that too, though he had never said it in words. Some stories you do not ask for. You set down food, and you keep the warm, and you wait, and if the person decides the place is safe, the story comes out on its own, the way water comes up through ground you have stopped digging at. And if it never comes, then it was never yours to have, and the food was given all the same. Outside, the light was going. The short November day was already failing toward the long blue dusk, and the wind had not let up. And somewhere out on the county road, Nora thought, though she did not say it, whatever the girl was watching for was still out there, still coming or not coming, and a girl who walked the last miles in, off a road like that, did not do it because the world behind her had been gentle. "You'll stay the night," Nora said. It came out flat, decided, the way she'd have said a thing about the weather. "The road's no place after dark out here, and it's coming on to snow. There's a room. It was my husband's mother's. It's cold, but the stovepipe runs through the wall, so it's not the worst. You can light out in the morning if that's what you want. But you'll not do it tonight." She watched the offer land on the girl, watched Selah brace against it the way she'd braced against the bread, suspicious of the size of it, hunting for the price. There was always a price. The girl's whole body said she had learned that somewhere, and learned it hard. And Nora, who had her own $76.40 and her own 33 ewes and her own snow coming, looked back at her steadily and let her hunt, because she knew the girl would not believe a kindness she had not first been allowed to distrust. "Why?" Selah said finally. It was barely a word. "Why would you?" And Nora, who had asked her dead husband that same question more than once across this same table. "Why him? Why this one? Why now when we've barely enough for ourselves?" heard her own answer come out of her mouth in his voice, in the murmur he'd used for frightened things, the words she had heard him say so many times she had stopped hearing them, until just now. "Because somebody has to," Nora said. "And tonight it turns out to be me." She got up and put more wood in the stove. Behind her, at the table, the girl who called herself Selah sat with both hands around a cooling cup of milk and a heel of bread in her sleeve, and an old blind dog asleep on her boot. And for the first time since she had come up out of the wind, she let her eyes close. Just for a moment. Just to feel what it was, after however long it had been, to sit in a warm room where no one was about to make her leave. She did not know it yet. But she had come up a road that had run out of road, to the door of a woman whose own road had run out the same way, and the two empty roads had met at one lit window on the edge of nowhere. And what came of that meeting would change the shape of both their lives, and the shape of more lives than either of them could have counted that night. Though all of that was still ahead, out past the dark and the coming snow, waiting. For now there was only the fire, and the food, and the dog, and a name half given, and a woman who had decided, the way her husband had taught her to decide, without weighing the cost, that nobody was going to leave this place hungry. not while she had anything left to give. The first snow came in the night, fine and dry and not much of it, enough to whiten the north faces of things and powder the backs of the ewes and lay a thin, clean page over the bench by morning. Nora was up before light, as she always was, and when she came into the kitchen, she found the girl already there. Seela was standing at the cold stove with kindling in her hands, and she had a fire half laid, and she had the look of someone caught doing a thing they were not sure they were allowed to do. She had slept in her clothes. Nora could see that. She had slept, maybe, in her boots. But she had gotten up in the dark, in a strange house, and gone for the wood box, and started the morning fire, because somewhere along the line she had learned that the surest way to be allowed to stay anywhere was to make herself into work the place could not do without. Nora did not make a thing of it. She said good morning, and she took down the coffee, and she let the girl finish the fire she had started, and when it caught, she said, "You've laid a fire before," and Celisa said, "Some," and that was the whole of the conversation, and it was enough. They ate oatmeal because the bread was gone. Nora watched the girl eat it slower than she'd eaten the night before, which she counted as a good sign, the body learning it could trust the next meal to come. The bruise on Sela's cheek looked less angry in the daylight. Her hands, wrapped around the bowl, were a young woman's hands, but they were not soft. They were nicked and calloused, the nails broken short, a long-heeled scar across the back of one of them. They were working hands. Whatever the girl had run from, it had not been an easy life she'd run from. It had been a hard one. After they ate, Sela asked what needed doing, and she asked it the way she'd asked for work at the gate, as though her right to the roof over her head ran out with the dawn and had to be earned fresh. So Nora put her to work, because she understood that for this girl, work was not a burden, but a handhold, the one thing in the world she knew how to grip. There was plenty of it. There was always plenty of it on a place that one aging woman could not keep up. Nora set her to splitting the pine rounds that had been waiting by the chopping block since October, and the girl took up the maul like she knew the heft of it, and she split wood the whole long cold morning, stopping only to stack what she'd split into a rack against the shed wall, her breath smoking, her dark hair stuck to her temples, until the woodpile, that had been Nora's quiet dread, reached the eaves the way it used to in Hal's day. Nora carried water and broke ice in the troughs and fed the ewes their thin morning ration of hay, and the dog went out with them and lay where he could see the pen, and the snow stopped, and the sun came thin and white off the big snowies, and for a few hours the place felt the way a place feels when there are enough hands on it. At noon Nora called the girl in and fed her, and Sela ate and went back out. In the afternoon they mended the wire on the lower fence where a winter-killed cottonwood had come down across it the year before, and Nora had never had the help to clear it. Seela held the strands while Nora stretched and twisted, and the girl was good with the wire, quick and careful, and at one point a barb caught the heel of Nora's glove and Seela's hand shot out and steadied her without thinking, a fast, sure motion, and then the girl flinched at her own boldness and drew back, and Nora said only, "Thank you," and they went on. It was while they were mending the fence that the first piece of the story came up, the way Hal had always said it would, out of the ground you'd stop digging at. They were resting against the truck bed, sharing the last coffee from the thermos, the dog stretched in the snow at their feet, and Seela was looking off down the county road the way she did, the watching never fully leaving her. And she said, not to Nora exactly, more to the road, that she'd worked sheep before. At a big outfit. Down south of here, she didn't say where. Shearing and lambing operation, hundreds and hundreds of head, crews that moved camp to camp through the season. She'd come on as a hand the spring she turned 19 because they took anyone, she said. And that was the thing about a place like that. They took anyone, and you found out why later. Nora kept still and let her talk. The way it worked, Sela said, was that the outfit advanced you things. Your boots off the truck marked against your pay. Your gloves, your bedroll, the food at the cook tent marked against your pay. A coat when it turned cold marked against your pay at the outfit's price, which was not the store's price. They drove you out to camps so far from any town that you could not leave on your own, and they held your pay against the season's end so you'd not run before the work was done. And somehow once in the season's end came the marks against your pay had eaten the pay, and you owed. And a person who owed could not just walk, the boss explained. Because walking on a debt was a thing the law took a dim view of, and he would surely have to involve the law. So you stayed, you worked the debt. And the next season the debt was still there, because there was always a new coat, a new pair of boots, the cook tent, the price of being driven out to the place where the work was. And the people who ran it were not stupid men. They knew exactly how much rope to give. They had been doing it a long time. Nora listened to all of it without moving, and a cold went through her that had nothing to do with the November air, because she had heard this before. Not lived it, heard it, a long time ago across the pine table in the kitchen from her husband's mouth about men he had known, men he had taken in. She had not thought of it in years. She filed it, the way you file a thing you do not yet know the use of. "How'd you get out?" Nora asked, gently. The first real question she'd let herself ask. Sela looked at the road a while. "I didn't get let out," she said. "There's a difference." And she pulled the collar of the borrowed coat up around her neck. Nora had put one of her own old wool coats by the door that morning and said nothing, and the girl had taken it and said nothing, and that too was a kind of conversation, and she did not say any more, and Nora did not ask. The bruise on her cheek said the rest of it, or enough of it. A person did not walk away clean from a thing like that. A person climbed out, over something, and carried the marks of the climb. That was act enough for one afternoon. They finished the fence in the failing light and went in, and Nora cooked, and the girl ate, and the second night Sela slept with her boots off. It was on the third day that they opened the bunkhouse. Nora had been putting it off for 11 years, if she was honest, the way she'd put off opening the bank notice, the way she put off all the rooms where Hal was still too present. The bunkhouse was a low log building out past the barn, a single long room with a stovepipe and 4 iron bedsteads and a plank floor, where in the old days the seasonal hands had slept, the men who came for shearing and stayed for lambing and moved on. After Hal died there had been no more hands, because there had been no more money to pay them, and the bunkhouse had simply closed, the door sweltering in its frame, the windows greasing over with dust, the beds going to rust. Nora had not been inside it since the spring before he passed. But the snow had shown her. The bunkhouse roof was failing at the north corner, and a failing roof would take the whole building by spring, and the building was good logs, logs that could shore up the barn. So on the third morning, she got the door open with her shoulder and a pry bar, and she and Sela went in to see what could be sabaged before the weather took it. It was cold and blue dark inside, the light coming gray through the dirty windows, the air thick with the smell of dust and old wool and mouse and cedar. Hal had lined the lower walls with cedar planks years ago against the damp, and the cedar still gave off its faint dry sweetness under everything else 11 years on. Nora stood in the doorway a moment and let the room have her, the 4 beds, the cold stove, a row of pegs on the wall where coats had hung, a long shelf where there had been books, a kerosene lamp, a tin wash basin, and against the far wall under the window, a low bench Hal had built, with a hinged lid, where the hands had kept their few things, a kind of common chest. They worked through the morning, carrying out what could be saved and stacking what could not. Sela worked without being told, and she had a good eye for it, sorting the sound wood from the punk, and somewhere in the work the wariness in her had thinned enough that she'd begun, once or twice, to almost talk. A remark about the cedar, a question about the brand burned into one of the bed frames, an H, inside a circle, Hal's mark, that Nora found she could explain without her throat closing, which surprised her. It was Sela who found the catch. She was clearing the long bench under the window, lifting the hinged lid to empty it, and the lid stuck, and she put her weight into it, and when it came up the whole bottom of the bench shifted under her hands. A false bottom, a second floor of planking below the first, that Nora had never known was there in 20 years of marriage. Sela went still. She looked up at Nora, uncertain, her hand on the loose board, the old habit of asking permission before touching anything that wasn't hers. Nora came across the room. She knelt down by the bench in the cold blue light, and she worked her fingers under the loose plank and lifted it. And here, before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If a story like this one, about quiet people, and the things they do for one another when no one is watching, and the way kindness can lie hidden for years and still hold. If a story like that means something to you, take a second right now to subscribe, and to tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. We are always amazed to learn how far these stories travel, into how many kitchens and trucks and late rooms. It costs you nothing, and it tells us to keep telling them now. Back to the cold bunkhouse, and the woman kneeling on the plank floor, and the thing under the false bottom of her dead husband's bench. Under the plank was a hollow, dry and clean, lined with more cedar, and in the hollow were 2 things. The first was a ledger, A big one, the kind feed stores and banks used to keep, bound in cracked black cloth, the corners worn to the board, thick as a Bible and near as heavy. The second was a cigar box, the paper label long since rubbed to nothing, held shut with a loop of soft cotton string. Nora lifted the ledger out with both hands and set it on her knees, and a dry breath of cedar and old paper came up off it. And she opened the cover, and she knew her husband's hand before she had read a single word. That slow, square, careful hand. The hand of a man for whom writing was hard work he did anyway. The first page was dated long before they were married, when Hal would have been hardly more than a boy with the place still new under him. At the top in Hal's square letters, he had written 4 words and only 4 like a title or a vow. Nobody leaves here hungry. And below that the names began. They ran down the page in 2 columns, and over the page, and over the next, year after year, the ink changing from black to blue and back to black as the bottles changed, the hand aging across the decades from a young man's care to an old man's tremor. Beside each name a date, beside the date a few words no more in Hal's plain telling. A man's name, and came in off the Roundup Road, snowed in 3 weeks, mended the corral, went on to Billings in March. A woman's name, and she and the boy, husband, was bad to them, stayed the winter. I drove them to her sister in Great Falls, told no one. A name, and Basque, no English, hurt his back at the Vendome outfit, and they turned him off owing them, stayed and healed, good with the lambs, sent for his brother. A name and the words owed Aldous, which Nora's eye snagged on and held. A name, and half froze on the bench road, fed him. He stole the lamp and the rope and went in the night, no matter, hope it served him. Name after name after name. Some stayed a night, some stayed a season, some by the notes had stayed years. Beside a few of the names, much later in a different ink, Hal had gone back and added a single word, settled or married or a town or once simply good, as though over the decades he had kept track of where his strangers had landed, the way another man might follow the fortunes of horses he'd sold. Nora turned the pages and could not stop turning them, and the cold of the bunkhouse left her entirely, because the room was filling up, not with ghosts, with the living. Every name a person who had come up that lane the way Sella had come up it, watching the road behind them, asking for work and expecting nothing, and had been fed and warmed and let stay and sent on whole by the big, slow man she had been married to for 20 years and had thought she had known all the way to the bottom. She had known he was kind. She had known he gave more than they could afford. She had sat at that table and watched him do it, and had loved him for it, and been frightened by it both. But she had thought it was a few, a handful, the odd traveler. She had never known it was this. Hundreds, the whole long, unbroken line of them, going back to before she was even his wife, carried in secret in a hollow under a bench, in a building she had closed and not entered for 11 years. She had grieved a sheepman. She had been married, it turned out, to something larger, and had never fully seen it, and now he was 11 years in the ground, and could not be asked a single question about any of it. Beside her, Sella had gone very quiet. She was looking at the open ledger, at the columns of names, and Nora watched her, read down a page, watched her mouth the way she read, the way a person reads who taught themselves late and in hard places. And Nora saw the exact moment the girl understood what the book was. Saw her understand that she was not the first to come up that lane in the wrong jacket watching the road. That there had been 100 of her. That the kindness she had distrusted, hunted for the price of, braced against like a blow. That kindness had a history older than she was, written down in a dead man's hand under a 4-word vow, and that she had walked by pure blind chance off a county road into the one place in the world that had been built, secretly and for decades, to do exactly the thing it had done for her. The cigar box, when Nora opened it, was full of paper. Letters, postcards, a few photographs gone brown. Thank you notes in a dozen different hands, some barely literate, some careful. A postcard from Billings from the man snowed in 3 weeks, made it, working at the yards, will not forget. A letter, years old, the creases soft as cloth, from the woman with the boy. Hal, you never asked for anything and I never said it right. The boy is grown now and good, and it is because of that winter, God keep you. A child's drawing of a dog. A wedding announcement, a funeral card. The accumulated mail of a lifetime of small rescues, kept in a cigar box under a bench, where no one would ever find it because the man who kept it had not done any of it to be found. Nora sat back on her heels on the cold plank floor with the ledger open on her knees and the box of letters beside her, and the gray light coming through the dirty window, and the old blind dog who had pushed in through the door and come to lie against her, and the runaway girl kneeling across from her with her broken-nailed hands, and she did something she had not done in a long time. Not at the funeral, not in 11 years of cold mornings. She put her face in her hands and she wept. Not from grief, or not only, from the sheer size of what she had been standing next to all along and had not known. From the discovery that the man she missed had been even better than the man she missed, and had gone to his grave, letting her think it was a handful, the odd traveler, because the goodness had not been for the credit of it. It had been the work itself, the names in the book. After a while, when she had stopped, she became aware that the girl had moved closer, was kneeling near her now, not touching her, but near, the way you keep near a person who is hurting so they will know they are not alone in the room with it. And Selah said, in a small voice, the first thing she had ever offered Nora without being asked, she said, "I'd have made the book different. If I'd come and you'd turned me off, I'd have written you down as one more that turned me off. And I've got a long list of those." Nora wiped her face with the heel of her hand. She looked at the girl. "Then you'll write me down the other way," she said. "That's all. That's the whole of it, far as I can tell. You just keep on writing them down the other way." And she did not know, saying it, how soon and how hard that would be tested. But the line once spoken had the weight of a thing decided. She closed the ledger over her husband's vow and held it against her chest, in the cold, in the cedar-smelling dark, and the girl knelt beside her, and the dog leaned on them both, and outside the short day was already turning and down the county road, though neither of them knew it yet. A clean black truck had turned off the highway, and was coming, slow and certain, raising its thin plume of snow. But that was still a day off. First, the county had something to show Nora that she had also never known. Word travels strangely in country that empty. There are no near neighbors, and yet everyone knows everything, carried on the party line that still half worked, and over the counter at Del Hovland's feed store, and in the single cafe in Wren. Nora had told no one about the girl. But Del had seen Nora come in on the fourth day, and buy flour and beans and a sack of oats, and pay with crushed bills out of a tin, buying more than one woman ate. And Del was not a stupid man, and Del had carried her account 4 months without a word, and Del remembered some things about Hal Brandvold that the rest of the county had started to forget. And so it began quietly the way everything on the bench began. People started to come up the lane. The first was an old man named Emil Sorensen, who drove up in a truck older than the girl in a clean shirt as though for church, and would not come past the gate until he was asked, and stood turning his hat in his hands. He had brought a quarter of beef, frozen, in a feed sack, and a box of canning jars full of vegetables his late wife had put up, that he said would only go to waste with her gone. Nora knew him a little, the way you know everyone a little out there. But she had never known the thing he told her, standing at the gate with his hat in his hands while the girl watched from the doorway. He told her that in the winter of a year so long ago Nora had still been a child somewhere else. He had come up this same lane a young man, busted, run off from a bad situation he did not name, and Hal Brandvold had taken him in and fed him, and given him work through the cold, and never once asked him what he was running from. Emil had gone on in the spring and made something of himself, married, raised 4, buried his wife, and in all that time he had never spoken of that winter to a living soul, because Hal had asked him not to, had said only, when Emil tried to thank him, "Don't thank me. Just leave the next one's door open. That's the whole of the payment. Leave the next one's door open." Emil had spent 50 years leaving doors open, he said, on account of one winter. And now he had heard, the way you hear things, that Nora was up against it, and that there was a girl, and he had wanted to come while he still could, and bring what he could. And say the thing out loud at last, because Hal was gone, and somebody ought to know. Nora took the beef and the jars and asked the old man in for coffee, and he came, and he sat at the pine table where the ledger now lay closed, and he put his old hand flat on the cracked black cover and did not need to be told what it was. "Am I in there?" he asked. His voice had gone unsteady. Nora opened it and found him. It took some looking, but she found him, using his name in a young man's year, and beside it in Hal's square hand the plain words, and the later edition, in different ink, settled, "Good man." And the old fellow read his own name in a dead man's book, 50 years on, with a word like good written after it by the hand that had saved him, and he wept the way old men weep, without sound, the tears just running, and Selah stood in the kitchen doorway and watched, and Nora saw on the girl's face the dawning of something she could not yet name. But that looked, more than anything, like the first faint outline of hope. That was the start of it. Over the next days they kept coming. Not many, the country was too empty for many, but a steady few as the word moved. A woman in middle age who turned out to be the boy from the ledger entry about the husband who was bad to them. Except the boy was a grown man now and could not come himself. So his mother had come, the same woman who had written the soft creased letter, ancient now, and sharp as a tack driven up by a grandson. A Basque sheepman, Gray, who was the brother that had been sent for, and who spoke of Hal in careful English and called him, simply a good patron, the best he had known. A younger man, a county road grader, whose own father had been one of Hal's strangers, and had raised his son on the story. They came and they brought what they had, meat, wood, a mended harness, a day's labor, a casserole, a 50 in an envelope pressed into Nora's hand against her protest, and every one of them, before they left, asked the same shy question. Am I in the book? Or my father? Or the man who raised me? And Nora would open it and find them, and read the plain words, and watch a grown person meet, across the gap of decades, the proof in a dead man's hand that they had once mattered to somebody when they had mattered to no one. And every one of them, looking at Sella, understood without being told who she was and what she was, because they had all once been her. And not one of them looked at her the way the world had taught her to expect to be looked at. They looked at her the way you look at family you have not met yet. There was one evening in that week that Nora kept, afterward, the way you keep a few evenings out of a whole life. The visitors had gone. The supper was cleared. The wind had dropped, which it does sometimes on the bench in the deep cold, so that the silence outside was total. The kind of silence that has weight, the stars coming hard and close over the big snowies. Nora had lit the lamp and was darning a sock by it, and Sella sat across the table with the ledger open in front of her. Reading, the way she'd taken to doing in the evenings, going down the columns of names slow, mouthing them, and Juno lay between their feet under the table with his chin on the girl's boot. After a while, Scylla said, without looking up, what was he like? Nora's needle stopped. Nobody had asked her that in 11 years. The people who'd known Hal didn't need to ask, and the people who hadn't didn't think to, and Nora had carried the answer around so long unspoken that she'd half forgotten it could be said out loud. She set the sock down. She looked at the lamp. She said, slow on purpose, I came to understand, not slow in the head. He'd take a minute to answer the simplest thing, and you'd want to shake him. And then the answer would come out and you'd see he'd use the minute. He smelled of sheep and pine tar, and that pipe he wasn't supposed to smoke. He could be in a room and you'd forget he was there. He was that quiet, and then you'd need a thing done and turn around, and it was already done. She picked the sock back up, set it down again. He never once told me he loved me, she said. Not in those words. I used to mind it when I was young. Then one winter I was sick, bad sick, the kind where you lose track of the days, and I came up out of it and the whole place had been kept perfect around me. Every animal fed, the fire never out, broth at my mouth every time I woke, for 2 weeks, and him not slept that I could tell. And I understood I'd been a fool to want the words. He'd been saying it the whole time. He just said it with his hands. Sella was quiet. Then she said low, nobody ever said it to me either. The words are the other way. Nora did not look at her too directly. You don't look directly at a wild thing offering you something. She said only, well, you're somewhere it gets said now. One way or the other. You'll get used to it. And the girl bent her head back over the book, but Nora saw her wipe her face once with the heel of her hand, fast, the way Nora herself did it, and neither of them remarked on it, and the lamp burned, and the dog sighed in his sleep, and that was the evening Nora kept. The next morning came another of them up the lane, and this one Nora had not expected and never forgot. A woman near Nora's own age, well-dressed, in a car with county plates that was not a ranch car, who turned out to be a nurse. The head nurse, in fact, at the hospital down in Lewistown, and who stood in the kitchen and would not sit, and told them she had not come up about the past at all, or not only. She had heard, the way you hear, that there was a young woman out here who'd come off the camps. She wanted the girl to know, she said, looking straight at Sella, that she ran a free clinic 2 Saturdays a month, and that anyone who'd been through what the camps did to a body could come. No questions, no name needed, no cost. And then, quieter, she said that her own mother had been one of Hal Brandvold's strangers, 50 years back, a Norwegian girl off the boat with no English, and a baby coming and a man who'd left her, and that Hal had taken her in and fetched the midwife himself through a blizzard, and that the baby had grown up to be a nurse, and the nurse had spent 30 years fetching other people through other blizzards, and that this was the only way she'd ever found to pay a debt that couldn't be paid, which was not to pay it back, but to pay it on. Leave the next one's door open. She'd had it from her mother, who'd had it from Hal. She'd come, she said, because it was her turn to be one of the doors. Nora opened the book and found the Norwegian girl, 50 years deep, in a younger hand than Nora had ever seen Hal use, from his first years on the place, and beside the name the few plain words in the late edition. And the word there, in the faded ink, was lived. Just that. Because sometimes that had been the whole of the victory, and Hal had known better than to ask for more. The nurse left her card on the table next to the ledger, and the two books sat there a moment side by side, the cracked black one and the small white one, and Nora thought they were, in the end, this book, only one of them was longer. By the end of that week, the woodpile reached the eaves, and the deep freeze was full, and the bank notice still lay unopened on the table. But it had stopped frightening Nora quite so much, because the arithmetic had changed. Not the arithmetic in the tin box, the older one, and Sella, who had come up the lane 4 days before watching the road and braced for a blow, had begun in small ways to unbend. She laughed once at something the Basque shepherd said about the dog. She slept through a whole night. She started, without being asked, to keep the ledger herself, to dust it, to set it square on the table, to handle it like a thing that was hers to tend. And one evening, Nora came in from the pen and found the girl sitting at the table with the book open and a pencil in her hand, not writing, just looking at the empty line below the last name, the place where the next name would go, with an expression on her face that Nora could not read. She did not know, then, whose name would go on that line, or how dearly it would have to be earned. She only knew that the line was waiting. They both did, and out on the county road, the black truck was almost to the gate. It was a Thursday, 8 days after the girl had come up out of the wind, and the snow had melted off the south slopes and lay only in the shadows, and Nora was in the lower pen dosing a ewe that had gone off her feet when she heard the engine. Not the cough of a country truck, a smooth engine, a new one, the sound money makes. She straightened up over the ewe and looked toward the road, and the dog was already on his feet, the hackles up along his spine, the low sound starting in his chest, and down at the gate a black truck had stopped, long, clean chrome catching the thin sun, a truck that had never hauled hay or hide in its life. A man got out. Even at that distance Nora could read him. He took his time. He stood by the truck a moment looking the place over, the way a man looks at property, taking inventory, and then he came up the lane unhurried, a tall man going soft at the middle, in a canvas coat that was the idea of a working coat, clean as the truck, and good boots that had never been ruined, and a hat that had cost more than Nora's ewes were worth by the head. He had an easy walk and an easy face, a salesman's face, the kind of face that has learned that smile is cheaper than honesty and works better. And when he was close enough, Nora saw the girl, who had come out of the barn at the sound of the engine, go absolutely still in the barn door, and then begin, slowly, to back into the dark of it, the way a creature backs from a thing it has met before and barely survived. Nora did not need to be told his name, but he gave it anyway, over the fence with the easy smile. Royce Aldous. He said it the way a man says a name he expects to be known, and tipped the expensive hat, and said he surely was sorry to trouble a lady at her work, and what a fine little place she had here, and then he looked past her at the barn, where the girl had gone, and the easy smile did not change, but the eyes did, just for a second, and Nora saw under the salesman the other thing, the thing the girl had run 40 miles of empty road to get away from. He had come for one of his people, he said. A girl who'd run off owing the outfit a considerable sum. He understood she'd been seen up this way, and he hoped there'd been a misunderstanding, because he'd hate to think a respectable woman had knowingly taken in someone who'd skipped out on a lawful debt. He said the word lawful the way you set a trap, gently, and let it sit there. He said the girl was bound by a contract she'd signed freely, he made sure to say, and that there were advances against her, real money, the outfit's money, and that a debt was a debt in the eyes of the law, and that he'd come all this way personally, rather than involve the sheriff out of consideration, but that of course he could involve the sheriff if it came to that, and wouldn't that be a shame for everyone? He kept smiling the whole time. He never once raised his voice. He didn't have to. He had said sheriff and lawful and contract and debt, and he had watched them land, and he had been doing this a long time, and he knew exactly how much rope to give. Nora stood on her side of the fence, in her dead husband's coat with manure on her boots, and the dog rigid at her knee, and she let him finish. She was not a quick woman. She had learned slowness from a slow man, and she had learned that a slow answer frightens a fast talker more than a fast one. When he was done, she looked at him a while, the way you look at weather coming, and then she said, "You'd be Aldous then, out of the south." The same, he said. Pleased to be known, your father. Nora said. Or your father's father. One of you ran that same outfit 40 years ago. The smile flickered. That'd be my father, he said, and his before him. Family business. It is, Nora said. I can see that. And she turned, without hurrying, and she said over her shoulder that he could wait at the gate. The law was particular, about a man coming onto another's land uninvited, and she'd be back directly. And she walked to the house with the dog beside her, leaving Royce Aldous standing with his easy smile gone a little fixed, because a thing had happened that did not usually happen to him, had not been frightened. That the person he had come to frighten had not been. In the house, Sela was pressed into the corner by the stove, where she could not be seen from the window, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking, and the 8 days of unbending had come undone in 8 seconds, the road back in her eyes. And she was saying, low and fast, that she'd just go with him. It was easier. Nora shouldn't have to. She'd known it would come to this. It always came to this. She should never have stayed. Nora crossed the room and took the girl by both shoulders. Not hard, the way Hal took a panicking you, firmly enough to be a chitukinj, and she said, look at me. And the girl looked at her. How old are you, Nora said. Sela said, Nora said, you're a grown woman. You signed no paper that can keep you anywhere you don't want to be. Not in this country, whatever that man told you, whatever he's been telling you. There's a name for what he runs, and it isn't a contract. Now you're going to stand right there, and you're going to let me handle this. Because it happens I have something he's going to want very much not to have seen. Before I tell you what Nora carried back out to that gate, let me ask you to do one thing if this story has reached you. If you believe, the way Hal Brandvold believed, the way the old man with the hat believed for 50 years, that the right answer to cruelty is to leave the next door open. Then take a second now to subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. There are more people than you'd think out there leaving doors open in the dark. And it helps them to know these stories are heard. Now, back to Nora crossing the yard with something black and heavy in her arms. She carried out the ledger. She set it on the hood of his clean black truck, where the cold sun could fall on it, and she opened it, not to the front but to a page deep in, a page she had marked, a page where the ink had gone brown with age. And she put her finger on a line, and she read it out to Royce Aldous in the flat, unhurried voice of a woman reading the weather. A man's name. A date 40-odd years gone, and beside it in her dead husband's square plain hand the words, came off the Aldous outfit, broke, they'd marked his whole season against boots and beans and driving, turned him off owing them, said the law would take him if he ran. Stayed the winter, healed up, there was more. She turned the page, there were others. Auft Aldous, run off the Aldous camps, same story. Aldous outfit again, the boy this time can't read, signed an X to a paper they read him wrong. Year after year, name after name, the same outfit, the same trick, written down plain by a sheepman who had taken in the broken ones the Aldouses spat out, and who had been, Nora understood now, keeping not just a book of kinds but a book of evidence, 40 years of it, a record in a steady private hand of exactly what that family had been doing to people too poor and too far from any town to fight it. Hal had never used it. Hal had not been that kind of man. He had just fed them and healed them and written it down and asked them to leave the next door open. But he had written it down, and the writing had outlived him, and it had a name on the cover of it that the law did know, and Royce Aldous, looking at 40 years of his family's business set down in the patient ink of a dead witness, stopped smiling for good. Nora did not raise her voice. She told him what she knew, in the plainest words, the way you tell a man a thing he already knows but had hoped you didn't. She told him there was a name for advancing a person their own boots and food at a markup, and then holding them to the place by a debt that could never be paid. She told him the law she came up under called that peonage, and that it had been against the law of this country for 150 years, and that no paper a frightened 19-year-old signed at a sheep camp 40 miles from a town could make it lawful, and that the only person at this gate who ought to be worried about the sheriff was the one who had been driving people out to camps. They couldn't leave. She told him that the girl was 20 years old and free as the wind that came off the big snowies, and would be staying, and that the debt, whatever number he'd written in whatever book of his own, was a fiction, and that they both knew it. And then she told him the last thing, and it was the only thing she said that had any edge to it. She told him that this book, and she laid her hand flat on the cracked black cover the way the old man had. This book had a great many names in it, and a great many of them were Aldous names, and that there were people up and down this country who had come off his family's camps and would remember, and that until this morning the book had been a private thing, a kindness, kept under a bench where no one would ever read it. But that books could be read, that a thing written down was a thing that could be taken to a county attorney, or a newspaper, or a federal man, any of whom would find 40 years of one family's name beside the same word interesting reading. She did not threaten him with it. She just let him understand that it existed, and that she had it, and that whether it stayed under a bench or not was a thing that depended entirely on how badly he wanted to keep standing at her gate talking about lawful debts. Royce Aldous looked at the book a long moment. He looked at the house, and the barn, and the empty land all around with no witness in it but an old woman and a runaway girl and a half-blind dog, and Nora watched him do the arithmetic she had counted on him doing, the only arithmetic a man like that knew. What's it worth? What's it cost? What's the play? And she watched him arrive where she'd known he would arrive, because she had built the gate so that all roads led there. That one girl, one debt, one season's wages was not worth what it would cost to fight a dead man's 40-year ledger, with his family's name written all through it. The girl had never been worth much to him in money. That was the whole horror of it, and the whole of his weakness too. He had come because people ran from him, and he could not abide a thing he owned getting away, but he had not come for so much that he would pay this price for it. He closed his mouth. He looked at Nora with a flat hatred that had no smile left in it at all, the look of a man who has been beaten by a thing he genuinely cannot understand. Beaten not by a better deal, but by a man who, dead 11 years, had simply written down the truth and left it where it could wait. He said something about how she'd regret taking in trash that wasn't hers. He said it because he had to say something, the way a man slams a door he's already been put out of. Nora did not answer it. She closed the ledger and picked it up off his hood, and she stood there holding it, and she waited, and after a moment Royce Aldous got back in his clean black truck and turned it around in the lane, the tires throwing gravel, and drove back down to the county road, and out of their lives, his thin plume of dust hanging in the cold air a while, and then settling, the way dust does, back onto the land it came from. Nora stood at the gate until the sound of him was gone. Then she became aware that the girl had come out of the house and was standing on the step, and that the dog had gone to her, and that Selah was looking at the empty road where the truck had been, with an expression Nora had not seen on her. In the 8 days she'd known her. Not relief. Something past relief. The look of a person who has watched the thing they were sure would always lose. Who has learned, at 20, in one cold morning at a gate, that it was not, after all, a law of nature that the Royce Aldouses of the world got to keep whatever they put their hand on. That a person could be too poor to fight and still, somehow, not be taken. That there were forces in the world stronger than the ones that had owned her. And that one of them was a black book written in a dead man's hand, and another was an old woman in a coat too big for her, and another, the strongest, did not have a name she'd been taught. "It's done," Nora said, coming up to her. "He won't be back. There's nothing here for a man like that." There never was. He just couldn't stand to know it. Selah said nothing for a while. Then she said very quietly, "You didn't have to do that. He could have made trouble for you. You've got little enough." And Nora, who had $76.40 8 days ago, and had less now and did not care, said the thing she had been coming toward her whole life without knowing it, the thing she had married into and lived alongside for 20 years, and only fully understood standing at a gate in November, watching a bad man drive away from a book. "I've got the book," she said, "and the book's got room. That's not little. That's about the biggest thing there is." That was the end of the worst of it. The winter that came on was a hard one, but they were ready for it in a way Nora had not been ready for a winter in 11 years, because there were 2 of them now, and a community that had remembered itself, and a deep freeze full, and a woodpile to the eaves. Selah stayed. There was never a day she decided to. There was just one morning, no more talk of going, the way the snow one day is simply there, and you cannot say which flake was the first. She turned out to be a born sheep hand. Hal would have seen it the first afternoon, Nora thought. Hal would have known by the way she held the wire. She learned the ewes by name and number. She pulled her first lamb in February, alone, in the dark, her arm to the shoulder in a straining ewe the way Hal used to, his old murmur coming out of her mouth though she had never heard him. And she brought it, living into the cold, and Nora found her in the gray morning asleep and with lamb against her chest, and stood in the barn door and did not wake her, and felt the whole long line of the ledger, close, like a circle, around the two of them. The girl told Nora her real name that spring. It was not Sella. Nora had known it would not be. She wrote it down anyway when it came, in the book. But I will keep it the way Hal kept things, which is to say I will not set it down here because some names are given in trust at a kitchen table and are not mine to spend. It is enough to say that the name went into the ledger, on the empty line below the last, in the girl's own hand, because Nora had her write it herself. And beside it Nora had her write the date she'd come up out of the wind, and the few plain words, the way Hal did it. And the girl sat at the pine table a long time over those few words, the pencil still, the way Nora had once seen her sit, and then she wrote them, and Nora read them later when the girl had gone out to the pen, and they were these. Came in off the bench road, watching behind her, owed nobody anything she really owed, stayed. And then, in a different press of the pencil, added, after, the way Hal added things, a single word, the same word he had written beside the old man with the hat, 50 years and a whole world away. Good. There is a thing about legacy, that a man's legacy is what he leaves behind, and they mean by it the land, the money, the name on the bank, the house that outlasts him. By that reckoning Halvor Brandvold left almost nothing. A failing place, 33 old ewes, a widow with $76 in a tin, a blind dog, and a building he'd closed up that was falling in at the north corner. By that reckoning he was a poor man who died poor, and the world, which keeps the kind of books Royce Aldous keeps, would have written him down as a small loss and moved on. But that is not the only kind of book. There was another book, under a bench, in a hollow lined with cedar, kept in a square patient hand across 40 years, and never shown to a soul. That said a different thing about what a man leaves behind. It said that a man's legacy is not what he owns. It is who got fed at his table when they had nowhere else. It is the doors that stay open down the years, because he asked, instead of thanks, only that the next one's door be left open too. It is a name written down, settled, married, good. Beside a stranger no one else would claim, so that decades later that stranger could read it and know they had once mattered when they mattered to no one. It is the line below the last name, kept empty on purpose, waiting, because the man who started the book knew he would not be the one to finish it, knew that the only way a kindness like his survives is if it is handed, like a lit thing, from one keeper to the next, on and on past his own death, past everyone's, for as long as there are roads with people walking up them watching the way behind. Nora Brandvold is keeping the book now. The girl will keep it after her. The line below the last name is empty again, and waiting, the way it is always waiting. The way it was waiting the day a thin girl in the wrong jacket stopped at a gate and asked for work she didn't believe she'd be given. And the 4 words are still there at the top of the first page, in the hand of a slow good man 11 years gone, who never once balanced his accounts and never once steered his wife wrong. Words that are not really about food at all, though they sound like they are, that turn out to be the whole of it, the entire law. The only thing that finally needs saying about how we are supposed to treat one another in the short cold time we have. Nobody leaves here hungry, not while there's anything left to give.